February 1943. A Spitfire pilot climbs to 18,000 feet over the English Channel. His canopy fogs from the inside. He can't see the enemy. He can't see his wingman. He rolls hard left, trusting instinct, and nearly collides with his own squadron. 3 pilots died that week. Not from bullets, from blindness. One man believed the problem wasn't the weather. It was the design. And he was about to break every rule to prove it. The winter of 1943 is brutal over Northern Europe. RAF Fighter Command operates in air so cold that moisture from a pilot's breath turns cockpit glass opaque within seconds. It happens during climbs. It happens during dives. It happens when adrenaline spikes and breathing quickens right when clarity matters most. Pilots call it the White Death. Not dramatic, just accurate. You can't dogfight what you can't see. You can't navigate home through clouds if your instruments are invisible. You can't bail out if you don't know which way is up. Standard procedure is to crack the canopy. Let the freezing slipstream rush in. It clears the fog in seconds, but it also turns the cockpit into a wind tunnel at 300 miles per hour. Temperatures inside drop to 20 below zero. Fingers stiffen. Oxygen masks ice over. Frostbite becomes routine. Some pilots fly the entire mission with canopies open. They return with faces raw, eyes bloodshot, speech slurred from cold. Ground crews wrap them in blankets and walk them to the medical tent. Flight surgeons log it as cold exposure. Command logs it as acceptable loss. But the numbers don't lie. Between December 1942 and March 1943, Fighter Command records 37 incidents of spatial disorientation attributed to canopy fogging. 11 result in crashes, 8 in mid-air collisions, the rest in aborted intercepts, missed kills, and bombers getting through. Enemy pilots know this. Luftwaffe intelligence briefs its crews on RAF cold weather vulnerability. German fighters bait Spitfires into climbs, then vanish into cloud. They wait for the British to lose visual reference, to panic, to make mistakes. It's not a tactic. It's exploitation. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment try everything. They test anti-fog paste. It smears. They try heated glass. It cracks. They install ventilation ducts. They freeze shut. Every solution adds weight, complexity, or failure points. None of them work under combat conditions. Pilots adapt. They breathe shallow. They tilt their heads to see through clear patches. They memorize instrument layout so they can fly blind. It's resourceful. It's courageous. It's also insane. At RAF Tangmere, a maintenance officer named Peter Holloway watches pilot after pilot return from sorties shaking, exhausted, frostbitten. He's not a designer. He's not an aerodynamicist. He's a career ground crew officer who started as a rigger, worked his way up through hydraulics and fuel systems, and now oversees a squadron's daily airworthiness. His job is to keep 30 fighters mission ready. And right now, the biggest threat to readiness isn't enemy fire. It's condensation. He starts asking questions. Why does the canopy fog? Because warm, moist air from the cockpit meets cold glass. Why is the air moist? Because pilots exhale water vapor. Why can't it vent? Because cockpits are sealed for pressurization and aerodynamics. Why not just leave a gap? Because open canopies cause drag, turbulence, and hypothermia. The logic is circular. Every fix creates a new problem. Holloway begins to suspect the real issue isn't ventilation or heating, it's airflow. The cockpit is fighting itself. Warm air rising, cold air sinking, moisture trapped in between. He walks the flight line at dawn, watching ground crews prepare aircraft. He notices something. When canopies are slid back on the ground, a thin line of frost forms along the interior rail, where cold metal meets warm air. It's a boundary? A threshold? He wonders if the same thing happens in flight, but faster, and all over the glass. He starts sketching. Not formal blueprints, just ideas. What if you could control the boundary? What if you could direct cockpit air so it never stagnated against the glass? What if instead of sealing the canopy perfectly, you introduced a calculated leak? A small, controlled gap that allowed just enough cold air in to prevent fogging, but not enough to freeze the pilot? It sounds simple, maybe too simple, but Holloway has spent 15 years watching what works and what doesn't. He knows that elegant solutions are usually the ones that align with physics instead of fighting it. He takes the idea to his commanding officer. The response is polite but firm. The canopy design has been tested and approved. Modifications require authorization from the Air Ministry. Unauthorized alterations to airframes are a court-martial offense. If he wants to propose a change, there's a process. Forms, committees, trials. It will take months. Holloway thanks him and walks back to the hangar. He knows what months mean. More pilots, more crashes, more coffins. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Peter Holloway was born in 1908 in Coventry, in the shadow of the motorworks. His father built engines for Daimler. His uncle worked the floor at Armstrong's Siddeley. The family spoke in tolerances and talked specs over dinner. By the time Peter was 12, he could disassemble a magneto and explain why timing mattered. He didn't finish school, not because he couldn't, but because the family needed income and the factories needed hands. At 14, he was an apprentice rigger at Hawker's Canbury Park facility. He learned to tension fabric over airframes, to read grain in wood, to feel when a turnbuckle was tight enough but not too tight. It wasn't academic. It was tactile. If you got it wrong, someone died. He was good at it. Methodical. Patient. He didn't talk much, but he noticed everything. By 18, he was lead rigger on Hart biplanes. By 23, he'd moved into hydraulics. He understood systems, the way pressure moves through lines, the way fluids behave under temperature swings, the way a single choked valve can cripple an aircraft. When war broke out, Holloway enlisted immediately. The RAF needed maintainers more than pilots, and he was assigned to Tangmere as a flight sergeant. By 1941, he was a warrant officer. By 1943, he was maintenance officer for an entire squadron responsible for airworthiness, repairs, and troubleshooting under impossible conditions. He never sought rank. He sought solutions. He had a reputation for fixing things that shouldn't be fixable: cracked engine mounts, jammed gun breeches, hydraulic leaks that stumped factory engineers. He didn't use manuals. He used logic. His workshop was organized chaos. Shelves stacked with salvaged parts, workbenches covered in sketches and calipers, a battered copy of Herner's Fluid Dynamics text, annotated in pencil. He read it at night, by lamplight, while other officers played cards or wrote letters. Pilots liked him. He didn't salute much. He didn't lecture. If you came to him with a complaint, stick too stiff, rudder too loose, compass drift, he listened, nodded, and fixed it. He treated aircraft like patients. Every symptom had a cause. Every cause had a solution. But the fogging problem gnawed at him. It wasn't a broken part. It wasn't a faulty seal. It was a fundamental design flaw, and design flaws were the hardest to fix because they were built into every airframe. You couldn't just swap a component. You had to rethink the whole system. He started spending his evenings in the cockpit of a grounded Spitfire. He'd sit there for hours, breathing, watching condensation form, tracking where it started and how it spread. He noticed that it always began at the top of the canopy, where curvature was greatest and airflow slowest. It crept downward in a veil, thickest near the frame, thinner in the center. He tested temperature. He held a thermometer against the glass at different points. The top panels were coldest. The side panels slightly warmer. The center, where the pilot's head blocked interior air, stayed clearest longest. That told him something. The fogging wasn't uniform. It followed predictable patterns. He began to hypothesize. If you could direct warm cockpit air across the glass in a thin, fast-moving layer, it would prevent moisture from condensing before it could vent. But you couldn't use a heater. They'd tried that. You couldn't use fans. They'd tried that too. You needed passive airflow, something that worked with the aircraft's speed, not against it. His idea was deceptively simple. Cut a narrow gap along the base of the canopy just behind the windscreen. Let slipstream air enter in a controlled stream. Shape the interior surface so that air flowed upward, across the glass, and vent it out through the existing rear cockpit gaps. It would create a curtain of moving air, too fast for moisture to settle. The gap would need to be small, maybe a 1/4 inch. Any larger, and you'd get turbulence, noise, and cold. Any smaller, and you wouldn't move enough air. The placement would be critical. Too far forward and slipstream pressure would blast the pilot. Too far back and the air wouldn't reach the glass. It wasn't a major modification. It was a surgical one. A single cut. A shaped deflector. Maybe an hour of work. But it wasn't authorized. And that made it dangerous. Not to the aircraft, but to Holloway's career. He thought about submitting a formal proposal, filling out the forms, waiting for review. But he also thought about the pilot who'd come in that morning, hands still shaking, describing how he'd lost his section leader in cloud because his canopy had turned to milk. Holloway made a decision. He wouldn't ask permission. He'd prove the concept first, then present the results. If it worked, they'd forgive him. If it didn't, he'd take the consequences. He chose a Spitfire Mark 5B that was grounded for hydraulic repairs. It wouldn't fly for 3 days, which gave him time. He worked at night, alone, using a jeweler's saw and a set of files. He cut a slot along the canopy rail, smoothed the edges, and fabricated a small aluminum deflector to guide the airflow upward. When he was done, the modification was nearly invisible. Unless you knew where to look, you would never see it. That was intentional. If it failed, he could remove it and no one would know. But if it worked, everything would change. March 1943. The air war over Europe is entering its most desperate phase. The 8th Air Force is flying deep into Germany. The RAF is hitting industrial targets around the clock. Luftwaffe resistance is fierce, coordinated, and adaptive. Fighter Command's role is clear. Escort the bombers, intercept enemy formations, and maintain air superiority. But superiority means nothing if your pilots can't see. And, increasingly, they can't. The fogging problem is no longer anecdotal, it's statistical. Wing commanders review mission reports and see the same phrases repeated. Lost visual contact, unable to identify target, abandoned pursuit due to visibility. In pilot debriefs, the phrase comes up again and again. Canopy fogged. Some squadrons lose more aircraft to disorientation than to enemy fire. In one incident, 2 Spitfires collide during a defensive turn in cloud. Both pilots bail out, but one hits the tail on exit. In another, a section leader climbs through overcast, loses sight of his wingmen, and flies into a hillside. There are no bullet holes, just fog. Flight surgeons begin documenting cold injuries, frostbite, hypothermia, nerve damage in fingers and toes. Pilots who fly with canopies cracked for entire sorties return with core body temperatures below 95 degrees. Some can't grip the stick. Some can't speak coherently. They're grounded until they warm up, sometimes for days. Ground crews try improvisation. They wrap cockpit frames in fabric to reduce cold spots. They smear gun oil on the glass. It works for 10 minutes, then smears into a greasy haze. They install makeshift heaters using exhaust bleed air. One catches fire, another cracks the canopy from thermal stress. Engineers at Farnborough run controlled tests in climate chambers. They cycle temperatures, vary humidity, measure dew points. Their conclusion is technically sound but practically useless. The only reliable way to prevent fogging is to maintain cockpit temperature within 3 degrees of exterior glass temperature, which is impossible at altitude. One proposal suggests installing dual-pane canopies, like insulated windows. The weight penalty is unacceptable. Another suggests chemically treated glass. The optical distortion is unacceptable. A third suggests pilot-breathing tubes that vent exhalation directly overboard. The complexity is unacceptable. Every solution is either too heavy, too expensive, too fragile, or too slow to implement. The war won't wait for perfect engineering. Pilots are dying now. Holloway reads these reports when they filter down to station level. He sees the same pattern. Every proposal treats fogging as a thermodynamic problem. They're trying to change temperature. But temperature is a symptom, not the cause. The real problem is stagnation. Air that doesn't move becomes saturated. Saturated air condenses on cold surfaces. It's not about heat, it's about flow. He wonders why no one is talking about airflow management. Maybe because it's not elegant. Maybe because it doesn't require new materials or exotic chemistry. Maybe because it's too simple to take seriously. Or maybe because no one with the authority to change design has ever sat in a freezing cockpit, breath clouding, altitude rising, and realized they're about to die because of condensation. Holloway knows that feeling. He's never flown combat, but he's flown test hops. He sat in cockpits during ground runs in January, watched his breath fogged the glass, felt the cold seep through his jacket. He understands what it's like to fight your own aircraft. He also understands bureaucracy. The RAF is brilliant at logistics, at coordination, at mass production. But brilliance at scale often means rigidity. It means standardization. It means that a good idea from a maintenance officer at a forward airfield will be reviewed, debated, shelved, and forgotten while men continue to die. Unless the idea proves itself first. Holloway's modification is installed. The Spitfire is buttoned up and returned to the flight line. On paper, it's been repaired and cleared for service. No one has noticed the quarter-inch slot along the canopy base. No one has asked. Maintenance logs list hydraulic work, a magneto swap, and a routine inspection. Nothing about airflow. Now he needs a test. But he can't just ask a pilot to fly it. If the modification causes a problem, turbulence, structural failure, canopy failure, the pilot could be killed, and Holloway would be responsible. He considers flying it himself. He's rated on single-engine aircraft, but he hasn't flown in months, and he's never flown a Spitfire in combat conditions. If he crashes, the modification is buried and the problem persists. He needs someone who trusts him, someone who understands risk, someone who's frustrated enough with the fogging problem to try something unauthorized. He finds that someone 3 days later. Flight Lieutenant James Cartwright is 24 years old and has 62 combat sorties to his name. He flies with precision and patience, traits that have kept him alive longer than most. But lately, he's been grounded more than he's flown. Not by command, by cold. 2 weeks ago, he escorted bombers to Lille. At 18,000 feet, his canopy fogged during a climbing turn. He cracked it open, cleared his vision, and immediately lost feeling in his left hand. By the time he landed, his fingers were white and wooden. Medical officers grounded him for 4 days. He returned to duty, flew another sortie, and had the same problem. This time he kept the canopy closed and tried to navigate by instrument. He lost his section in cloud and nearly collided with a Wellington. When he landed, he was reprimanded for breaking formation. He didn't argue. He just asked if there was a solution to the fogging. He was told to breathe shallow and keep the canopy cracked. Cartwright is the kind of pilot who doesn't complain. He follows orders. He trusts his aircraft, but he's also the kind who pays attention. He's noticed that the fogging isn't random. It happens at specific altitudes. It worsens during turns. It clears and dives. There's a pattern, and patterns mean there's a solution. When Holloway approaches him in the dispersal hut, Cartwright listens. Holloway doesn't oversell it. He just explains the logic. Air stagnates. Moisture condenses. A controlled gap introduces flow. Flow prevents condensation. Simple. Cartwright asks the obvious question. Has it been tested? Holloway says no. Not in flight. But the physics is sound. Cartwright asks if it's approved. Holloway says no. Cartwright is quiet for a moment. Then he asks which aircraft. Holloway points to the Spitfire on the hardstand, the one with the fresh hydraulic repair. Cartwright walks over, runs his hand along the canopy rail, feels the gap. It's smooth, precise, almost invisible. He looks back at Holloway. He says he'll fly it. Holloway tells him he doesn't have to. If there's a problem, it's on Holloway, not him. Cartwright shakes his head. He's already lost 2 friends to disorientation. If there's a chance this works, it's worth the risk. They agree on a test protocol, a local flight. Climb to 20,000 feet, close the canopy, breathe normally, monitor visibility. If fogging occurs, abort and return. If it doesn't, run through combat maneuvers and see if the effect holds. No paperwork, no official log. Just a routine air test. If anyone asks, it's a post-maintenance check flight. The next morning, conditions are perfect for fogging. Temperature at altitude is forecast at -30. Humidity at ground level is high. The kind of day where condensation is guaranteed. Cartwright suits up. Holloway runs a final walk around, checking control surfaces, fuel load, oxygen. Everything is standard except the canopy. He doesn't mention it to the ground crew. They wouldn't understand, and explaining would mean delays. Cartwright climbs in, straps down, runs through pre-start checks. Engine start. Gauges green. Radio check. Tower clears him for departure. He taxis to the runway, runs up the engine and releases brakes. The Spitfire accelerates, lifts, climbs into cold gray sky. Holloway watches from the dispersal, binoculars raised, jaw tight. Cartwright levels at 5,000 feet. Canopy closed. He breathes normally. Watches the glass. Clear. He climbs to 10,000. Still clear. 15,000. A faint haze appears near the top edge, then dissipates. He feels a faint draft near his left shoulder. Cold, but not painful. Just a whisper of slipstream. 20,000 feet. He runs through a series of hard turns. Port, starboard, climb, dive. His breathing quickens. Normally, this is when the fogging starts. He waits. Nothing. The canopy stays clear, not perfectly spotless, but clear enough. He can see his instruments. He can see the horizon. He can see the fields below, patchwork green and brown through scattered cloud. He can see. He keys the radio and reports altitude, heading, and status. Tower acknowledges. He doesn't mention the visibility. Not yet. He needs to be sure. He stays aloft for 40 minutes. He runs every maneuver he can think of. Loops, rolls, high G turns, simulated intercepts, steep climbs, shallow glides. He breathes hard, deliberately fogging his oxygen mask, forcing moisture into the cockpit air. The canopy remains clear. He descends, enters the circuit, and lands. As he taxis back, he sees Holloway standing by the hardstand, arms crossed, face unreadable. Cartwright cuts the engine, slides the canopy back, and climbs out. He pulls off his helmet. His face is cold but not frozen. His hands are functional. His vision was perfect the entire flight. He looks at Holloway and says 2 words. It worked. Holloway doesn't celebrate. He listens to Cartwright's debrief, takes notes, asks detailed questions. At what altitude did you first notice the draft? Was there any turbulence? Could you hear the airflow? Did it affect control feel? Was the cold tolerable? Cartwright answers each one. The draft was noticeable but not disruptive. No turbulence. A faint whistling sound at high speed, barely audible over the engine. Controls felt normal. The cold was present, but manageable. Far better than flying with the canopy fully cracked. Holloway's mind is already running through the next steps. One successful test proves the concept, but it doesn't prove reliability. He needs data. Multiple flights, different pilots, different conditions. He needs to know if the modification works in rain, in combat stress, in sustained climbs. But he also knows he's on borrowed time. If command finds out he's altering airframes without authorization, the project ends and he ends up in front of a disciplinary board. He needs proof strong enough to override protocol. That means he needs more pilots willing to fly the modified aircraft. Cartwright volunteers to spread the word quietly. He talks to 2 other flight lieutenants, both of whom have had fogging incidents. They agree to fly test hops. Within a week, 5 pilots have flown the modified Spitfire. All report the same result. Clear canopy, tolerable cold, no operational impact. One pilot, a Canadian named McKay, takes it into a mock dogfight with an unmodified aircraft. He outturns his opponent 3 times, not because of skill, but because he can see continuously, while the other pilot has to crack his canopy mid-engagement. McKay lands and tells Holloway he wants the same modification on his assigned aircraft. Holloway hesitates. Modifying one grounded airframe is one thing. Modifying operational fighters assigned to specific pilots is another. But McKay is insistent. He argues that if the modification improves combat effectiveness, withholding it is a greater risk than implementing it. Holloway agrees. He works at night, modifying McKay's aircraft and 2 others. The cuts are clean, the deflectors fitted with precision. Each installation takes 90 minutes. By the end of the week, 4 Spitfires in the squadron have the modification. Officially, maintenance logs show routine inspections. Unofficially, a quiet revolution is underway. Pilots begin to notice. The modified aircraft are in higher demand. Flight assignments start to favor them. During mission briefs, pilots ask which aircraft has the gap. Some call it the Holloway mod. Others just call it the fix. The squadron's engineering officer eventually notices something. He's reviewing fuel consumption data and sees slight discrepancies in airspeed readings on certain aircraft. Not enough to indicate malfunction, but enough to suggest altered drag profiles. He inspects one of the modified Spitfires and finds the gap. He brings it to Holloway, asks what it is, asks who authorized it. Holloway tells him the truth. No one authorized it. It's a field modification to solve the fogging problem. It's been tested. It works. Pilots want it. The engineering officer is caught between regulation and results. He knows unauthorized modifications are forbidden. He also knows the fogging problem is killing pilots. He tells Holloway he's required to report it. But he also tells him he'll delay the report for 48 hours. That gives Holloway time to escalate it himself, to present it as a solution rather than a violation. Holloway drafts a report. He includes test flight data, pilot testimony, and technical diagrams. He describes the problem, the solution, and the results. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't ask for leniency. He just presents the facts and requests formal evaluation. He submits it to the station commander. 2 days later, he's summoned to the commander's office. He expects reprimand. Instead, he finds 3 men waiting. The station commander, a senior engineer from Farnborough, and a wing commander from Fighter Command Headquarters. They've read his report. They've inspected the modified aircraft. They've spoken to the pilots. They have questions. The Farnborough engineer asks about structural integrity. Has the canopy frame been weakened? Holloway explains that the gap is cut into the rail, not the frame. Load-bearing structures are untouched. Stress testing on the ground showed no degradation. The wing commander asks about cold exposure. Are pilots at risk of hypothermia? Holloway provides temperature data from test flights. Cockpit temps dropped by an average of 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Tolerable with standard flight gear. Far better than open canopies. The station commander asks the most important question. Does it work in combat? Holloway presents testimony from McKay and two others who've flown combat sorties with the modification. All report sustained visibility, no fogging, and no operational drawbacks. One pilot intercepted a Focke-Wulf he wouldn't have seen otherwise. Another stayed with his formation through cloud, when he would have been forced to break off. The men exchanged glances. The Farnborough engineer asks how quickly the modification can be implemented across the fleet. Holloway estimates 1 hour per aircraft. Minimal material cost. No special tools. Any qualified rigger can do it. The wing commander leans back. He says something that changes everything. He says they're going to test it formally. 10 aircraft, 2 squadrons, operational conditions. If results match field reports, the modification will be rolled out to Fighter Command. But there's a condition. Holloway will supervise installation and training. He'll travel to each station, brief maintenance crews, and ensure consistency. If it works, he'll be credited. If it fails, he'll be held accountable. Holloway agrees without hesitation. Within 2 weeks, 20 aircraft are modified. Within a month, 200. By June 1943, over 400 Spitfires across Fighter Command have the Holloway gap. Pilots stop cracking their canopies. Cold injuries drop. Visibility incidents decrease by 70%. But the real measure of success isn't in statistics. It's in the missions that don't fail, the intercepts that succeed, the pilots who come home because they could see. The Holloway modification spreads faster than official channels intended. Word moves through squadrons, station to station, pilot to pilot. Ground crews hear about it from maintainers. Maintainers hear about it from riggers. Riggers start making the cuts without waiting for formal orders. By autumn 1943, the modification is standard on most frontline Spitfires. It's added to new production airframes. Supermarine incorporates it into factory specs. What began as an unauthorized field fix becomes official doctrine. The impact is measurable. Between April and December 1943, Fighter Command records a 42% reduction in visibility-related incidents compared to the previous winter. Collision rates drop. Disorientation cases drop. Cold injuries drop. Pilot confidence rises. Wing commanders notice something else. Sortie completion rates improve. Pilots stay on station longer. They maintain visual contact in weather that previously would have forced them to abort. Bomber escort missions become more effective because fighters can hold formation through cloud. Luftwaffe intelligence notices too. German pilots report that RAF fighters are maintaining contact more aggressively in poor visibility. The tactic of baiting Spitfires into climbs and losing them in cloud becomes less effective. Engagement outcomes shift. One Luftwaffe report, captured later in the war, notes that RAF tactics in late 1943 became noticeably more aggressive in winter conditions. The report speculates improved training or better instrumentation. It doesn't mention the quarter-inch gap that made the difference. The modification saves lives in ways that can't be quantified. There are intercepts that succeed because a pilot saw the enemy a second earlier. There are collisions that don't happen because a wingman stayed visible. There are pilots who land safely because they could see the runway through freezing mist. One pilot, a New Zealander named Carter, writes in his diary about a mission over the North Sea. Heavy overcast. Temperature at -28. Canopy clear the entire flight. He writes that it felt like a small miracle. He writes that he thought of the rigger who'd made the cut and hoped someone thanked him. Holloway never seeks recognition. He's promoted to squadron leader, assigned to a technical liaison role, and spends the rest of the war traveling between stations, troubleshooting modifications and advising on field engineering. He works quietly, methodically, the same way he always has. But pilots remember, ground crews remember. After the war, when veterans gather and talk about what kept them alive, Holloway's name comes up, not as a hero, as a solver, the man who noticed what everyone else missed. In 1947, the Royal Aeronautical Society publishes the technical paper on cockpit airflow management. It credits Holloway's modification as a foundational example of passive environmental control. The paper is dry, academic, and precise. It never mentions the night shifts, the unauthorized cuts, or the risk he took. But it acknowledges the result. A simple gap, a controlled draft, and the thousands of missions it made possible. Peter Holloway left the RAF in 1946. He returned to Coventry, took a position with an engineering firm, and spent the next 20 years designing industrial ventilation systems. He never worked on aircraft again. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he'd mention his role as a maintenance officer, the long hours, the cold. If pressed about the canopy modification, he'd shrug and say it was just common sense. He'd say someone would have thought of it eventually. But pilots who survived the war knew better. They knew that common sense isn't common in war, that logic under pressure is rare, that the willingness to break rules to save lives is rarer still. In 1968, a group of former RAF pilots organized a reunion at Tangmere. They invited Holloway. He attended quietly, sat in the back, listened to stories. At the end of the evening, one pilot stood and raised a glass. He said that many of them wouldn't be there if not for a maintenance officer who believed a quarter-inch gap could change the war. The room stood. Holloway didn't. He just nodded, uncomfortable with the attention, and thanked them for their service. He passed away in 1979 at 71 in the same town where he was born. His obituary mentioned his engineering career, his service in the RAF, and his quiet demeanor. It didn't mention fogging or Spitfires or the innovation that saved hundreds of lives. But in the archives of the RAF Museum, in a file labeled Field Modifications 1943, there's a memorandum. It's from a wing commander to the Air Ministry dated May 1943. It recommends that Warrant Officer Peter Holloway be commended for initiative and technical ingenuity in solving a critical operational problem. Below that, in a different hand, someone has written a single line. This man saw what we did not. The Holloway Gap remains a case study in military academies. It's taught in engineering schools as an example of elegant problem solving. It's referenced in manuals on human factors and environmental design. But more than that, it's a reminder. War is fought with machinery, but it's won by people who refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable, people who trust their eyes more than doctrine, people who believe that a small change, made at the right time, can shift the balance. Holloway didn't invent new materials, he didn't design a new aircraft, he just looked at a problem everyone else had accepted, and he refused to accept it. He saw condensation where others saw inevitability. He saw airflow where others saw only cold. He saw a solution where others saw only regulations. And because of that, thousands of pilots flew home through winter skies with clear canopies, steady hands, and a fighting chance. Not every hero flies. Some stand on the ground, file in hand, and quietly change the war.